Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. It's good to see a good audience and a good student audience on a sunny afternoon in the spring. One of the McFarland Center's major initiatives launched last year is Catholics and Cultures. This web-based resource at catholicsandcultures.org explores how ordinary Catholics live and practice their faith in particular countries and cultural contexts around the world. I'd encourage you to visit the site if you have a chance, and also to sign up if you want to receive emails when new content is added to the site. The Catholics and Cultures site and content, audio, video, has been extremely well received. We've had more than 100,000 viewers in the first year and 50,000 YouTube viewers, so I'm happy with that, with about 20 different countries. Rwanda isn't yet one of them, but we're looking to get there. Today's speaker, whose work is focused on modern Catholic history and theology in Africa, is a member of the Catholics and Cultures International Advisory Committee. He'll be contributing to the site, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. James J. Carney, or Jay Carney, is Assistant Professor of Theology and Director of the African Studies Program at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. His work is focused on the Great Lakes region of Africa, that is Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's also interested in theology and history of Christian social reconciliation, political theology, and the history of Christian missions. His first book, a prelude to what we'll be talking about today, is called Rwanda Before the Genocide, Catholic Politics and Ethnic Discourse in the Late Colonial Era, which was published in 2014. It won the African Studies Association 2015 Bethwell A. Ogot Prize for the best book in East African Studies. He also published an article in Theological Studies last year titled A Generation After Genocide, Catholic Reconciliation in Rwanda. Jay's shifting his fieldwork a little bit towards Uganda, exploring post-colonial Catholic leadership there, and he'll be taking Creighton students to Tanzania this summer. Today, however, we're looking forward to learning more about the Rwandan situation facing the country and the legacy of an extremely painful event in that country's history. His talk is titled The Politics of Mercy, Ambassadors of Reconciliation in Post-Genocide Rwanda. Thanks for coming, Jay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Dr. Landy for the introduction and the invitation to speak here today. It's an honor to be here at Holy Cross. It's my first visit to your beautiful campus, and I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to share an hour together. And for you students out there, I hope this will be worth your time and the extra credit I hope you receive. Before I begin my lecture today, I'd like us to pause for a moment of silence. April is the month of remembrance in Rwanda. Over the course of 100 days, between April and July 1994, 800,000 Rwandans, more than 90% of the nation's Tutsi population, were killed. Thousands more Rwandan exiles and millions of Congolese died in the Great Congo War that followed in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So let us pause in prayer to remember all the victims and their families, and to pray for reconciliation in Rwanda, Congo, and around the world. Thank you. Pope Francis has declared 2016 as a Jubilee year of mercy, calling on Catholics to reflect more on mercy as the face of God and how the Church can embody a more merciful face to the world. Rhetorically, mercy has never been more in vogue, at least in Catholic circles. But is there such a thing as a politics of mercy? One could be forgiven for thinking otherwise, especially in the midst of the most divisive U.S. presidential cycle since at least 1968. Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, engaged in a sophomoric spat of character assassination while looking to one-up each other in their uncompromising rhetoric toward immigrants, Muslims, China, and liberals. On the left, Bernie Sanders lambasts a rigged economic system, calling for a political revolution that will liberate America from the plutocrats of Wall Street. In describing the current political mood in America, one thinks of words like populism, anger, conflict, fear, and loathing. I have not heard many commentators mention the word mercy. On its face, then, the title of my lecture, The Praxis and Politics of Mercy, is audacious to say the least. Thankfully, my argument today does not rest on the vagaries of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. I'll save that for the fall lecture at the College of the Holy Cross. Rather, the country I have in mind is the small Central African nation of Rwanda. The politics I will narrate is not that of the presidency and parliament, but rather the local, painstaking, grassroots efforts to reconcile Rwandan society. I will tell this story today in 4 parts. First, I will briefly outline modern Rwanda's shift from a politics of justice in the late 1950s to a politics of vengeance in the post-colonial period to a politics of reconciliation today. I will especially highlight the role of key Catholic leaders and Catholic social ideals throughout this process. Second, I will describe what I see as 3 key principles of a praxis of mercy, drawing particularly on the writings of Pope Francis, as well as the Latin American liberation theologian John Sobrino. Third, I will describe the ministries of 3 Catholic ambassadors of reconciliation in post-genocide Rwanda, highlighting what I see as their contributions to an overall praxis of mercy. And finally, I will trace some of the potential connections between this praxis of mercy and a broader politics of mercy in contemporary Rwanda and beyond. And I look forward to discussing that more in the question and answer following. I would just notice that this is actually the Catholic bishop's residence in Butare in southern Rwanda. And you notice that the title of the street, Ubuntu Street. If you know African cultural traditions, this is, of course, a reference to the principle of community harmony out of African culture. The late colonial period in Rwanda saw the emergence of what I would call a politics of justice. After 4 decades of Belgian colonial rule, with colonial officials working hand in hand with both Catholic missionaries and a mostly Tutsi-dominated oligarchy, there was growing ferment in the late 1950s for a more equitable distribution of land, wealth, and political power to benefit the majority Hutu peasant population. Catholic missionaries were centrally involved in this politics of justice in Rwanda, reflecting the Catholic Church's power as the established church in colonial Rwanda. In particular, a younger post-war generation of Rwandan clerical leaders enunciated a broadly anti-communist, democratic vision of Catholic social teaching that quickly evolved into a general call to empower the Hutu masses. A representative figure of this politics of justice was Bishop André Perodin, a Swiss native and white father missionary who began serving as Vicar Apostolic of Rwanda in 1956. Perodin had been a popular professor at Rwanda's Nyakabanda Major Seminary, known in particular for his courses in Catholic social teaching. Early in his episcopate, Bishop Perodin steered clear of political controversy, especially the Hutu-Tutsi question that was beginning to roil church, state, and civil society. But in 1959, he released his most controversial pastoral letter, Super Omnia Caritas, above all things charity, in which he framed Rwanda's social stratification along an explicitly Hutu-Tutsi axis and described these categories in controversial racial terms. Perodin's letter offered a tacit endorsement of emerging Hutu political movements, framing the church's option for the poor largely in terms of a commitment to the Hutu masses. The close association of Perodin with Catholic Hutu political leaders would only grow in the post-colonial era. One of these Catholic Hutu political leaders was Gregor Kayibanda, perhaps the best embodiment of the politics of vengeance narrative that came to dominate post-colonial Rwanda. A native of the Gitarama region near Perodin's Sea of Kabgayi, Kayibanda had spent much of the 1940s in Catholic seminaries before embarking on a successful career as a lay Catholic journalist and agricultural cooperative leader in the 1950s. In 1957, he founded the movement Social Muhutu to advocate for the rights of Hutu peasants. And 2 years later, he turned this movement into a formal political party known as Parmehutu. Kayibanda and other Parmehutu leaders helped spark November 1959 uprisings against the Tutsi-dominated oligarchy, driving thousands of Tutsi into exile in Uganda, Burundi, and Congo. With widespread grassroots networks, missionary advisors, and the tacit support of the Belgian military leader, Colonel Guy Logies, Parmehutu swept to power in legislative elections in 1960 and 61. Kayibanda became Rwanda's first president after independence in 1962 and served until a military coup in 1973. Under Kayibanda's and Parmehutu's influence, post-colonial Rwanda was dominated by a Hutu nationalism that drew its energy from a vitriolic politics of vengeance. Much of this drew on the rhetoric of a politics of justice, associating Hutu with the poor and the common people, and scapegoating Tutsi as the wealthy, historic oppressors of the Hutu and fifth-column traitors to the new Hutu nation. For example, a June 1960 Parmehutu manifesto claimed that, quote, Rwanda is the country of Hutu, and of all those, whites or blacks, Tutsi, Europeans, or other neighbors, who will rid themselves from feudal imperialistic designs. In the face of Tutsi exile incursions in the early 1960s, Hutu government agents orchestrated popular retribution against local Tutsi, most infamously at Gikongoro in southern Rwanda, in which over 8,000 Tutsi civilians were killed over the course of a fortnight in December 1963 and January 1964. Rwanda would experience other paroxysms of anti-Tutsi violence in the post-colonial era, including massacres and expulsions in Catholic schools and seminaries in 1973. I should add that Rwanda's violence was often linked to a similar politics of vengeance in neighboring Burundi, where the ethnic power dynamic was reversed, namely a Tutsi-dominated military persecuting Hutu, such as the infamous Burundian genocide of 1972, in which over 200,000 Hutu were killed. This politics of vengeance ultimately culminated with the 1994 genocide. Time does not allow for a full recounting of the events leading up to the genocide, but I would highlight a few key factors that underlay the theme of vengeance. First, the genocide happened in the aftermath of a civil war. The Tutsi-dominated Rwanda Patriotic Front, or RPF, invaded Rwanda from Uganda in October 1990 in hopes of toppling the government of Juvenal Habyarimana, himself a Hutu from the north, and creating space for the resettlement of thousands of Tutsi refugees. The war played out in northern Rwanda over the next 3 years, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians and fomenting a desire for vengeance among many northern Hutu survivors. Second, the genocide unfolded after the Habyarimana government agreed in 1990 to move from a one-party to a multi-party democratic system. While this opening was a welcome development and kept with the spirit of the third wave of African democratization in the early 1990s, it also unleashed forces of political extremism, not unlike what we are seeing in America today. On the backdrop of continued civil war, Hutu hate radio, such as the infamous Kanguru, began calling for the extirpation and extermination of Tutsi. The ruling party's youth wing and other Hutu radical groups responded, committing 6 massacres of Tutsi between 1990 and 1993. I should note with little to no international reaction. After the August 1993 signing of the Arusha peace accords between the RPF and the Habyarimana regime, Hutu extremists within the government who were upset with this peace plan developed an apocalyptic plan to eliminate Rwanda's Tutsi population once and for all. The genocidal plan swung into action after the 6 April 1994 shooting down of a plane carrying President Habyarimana and Cyprien Ntaryamira, Burundi's president. Massacres commenced in Kigali, and the interim government of Jean Kambanda methodically expanded the genocide across the nation throughout April, May, and June. By the time the RPF liberated Kigali on July 4th, at least 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu lay dead, many of the victims massacred after seeking refuge in Catholic parishes, schools, and hospitals. Even as local Rwandan bishops failed to speak out in the early weeks of the genocide, an aging Monsignor Peredin gave an April 1994 interview back home in Switzerland, reflecting the rhetorical power of the politics of justice, even in the midst of genocidal vengeance. In Peredin's words, the Hutus act out of anger and fear, by anger against the death of their president, Juvenal Habyarimana, and by fear of returning to a system of slavery, an institution of pride and domination by one race over the other. In the 2 decades since the politics of vengeance culminated with genocide, the post-genocide RPF government has embraced what I would term a politics of reconciliation. The Ndi Umunyarwanda, or I Am Rwandan campaign embodies the government's approach to national reconciliation. The American scholar Jenny Burnett describes this in terms of Rwanda's determination to replace ethnicity and, quote, other potentially divisive sub-state loyalties with an undifferentiating concept of Rwandanness, end quote. In this vein, the RPF government has instituted a wide range of practices and symbols, including eliminating public reference to Hutu and Tutsi ethnic identities, creating Ngando re-education camps for former Hutu militia members and other political opponents, mandating community participation in Umuganda work projects on the last Saturday of every month, organizing one-day seminars on national identity, and instituting annual remembrance periods of the genocide against the Tutsi. On a local level, the Gacaca process has been the dominant judicial means of this politics of reconciliation. Literally translated as on the grass, Gacaca harkens back to traditional community justice methods in which local elders known as Inyangamugayo mediated local disputes, meeting on the grass of the inner courtyard of a Rwandan homestead. In 2001, the RPF government announced that it would introduce a modernized version of Gacaca to help process Rwanda's burgeoning prison population of over 120,000 accused genocidaires or genocide perpetrators. In exchange for a full disclosure of crimes, the naming of accomplices, and expressions of remorse, genocidaires could receive reduced prison sentences or community service within their home villages and provinces. Between 2005 and 2012, upwards of 2 million cases, approximately 25% of the national population, were tried through the Gacaca process, and around 65% of suspects were convicted. Critics have challenged Gacaca's lack of legal due process, exclusion of RPF human rights violations, and implicit incentivizing of false confessions and accusations. For more sympathetic observers, however, Gacaca was an imperfect but necessary means of ending impunity, achieving a measure of restorative justice, and facilitating the face-to-face encounters necessary to reestablish social trust in Rwanda. Having offered a brief sketch of the politics of justice, vengeance, and reconciliation in recent Rwandan history, let me now turn to the issue of mercy. Echoing Pope Francis, I would define mercy here in terms of its Latin root, misericordis, namely opening one's heart to misery or wretchedness. In addition, I would highlight 4 key components of a praxis of mercy that emerged from the writings of Pope Francis, as well as the Latin American liberation theologian John Sobrino. I would add writing in the context of El Salvador, and similar context of Rwanda, of deep social conflict. First, the praxis of mercy is based on what Sobrino terms a principle of mercy, namely a fundamental orientation opening one's heart to the sufferings of the other. For Sobrino, this principle of mercy is the essence of God's love and Jesus' mission. Jesus' healing works are above all responses to the concrete sufferings of those around him, not magical acts designed to convince observers of his divine identity, as many of my first-year theology students think. In turn, for Sobrino, the principle of mercy is more dangerous than mere works of mercy, as it involves social analysis and denunciation of the structures of oppression that lead to the sufferings of what Sobrino calls the crucified peoples. In Sobrino's words, what this world will not tolerate is a church molded by the principle of mercy, which leads the church to denounce robbers who victimize, to lay bare the lie that conceals oppression, and to encourage victims to win their freedom from culprits. Ultimately, then, the principle of mercy points to liberation and empowerment of the victims, reversing the former power dynamic. For Sobrino, mercy has a moral hierarchy, and victims come first. Second, both Sobrino and Francis emphasize the importance of a shattered heart for a praxis of mercy. As in the prodigal son narrative, the merciful father's generous welcome is preceded by the younger son's own shattered heart, embodied in an experience of shame and the desire for reintegration. In Pope Francis's words, The church fathers teach us that a shattered heart is the most pleasing gift to God. It is a sign that we are conscious of our sins, of the evil we have done, of our wretchedness, and of our need for forgiveness and mercy. This process can unfold on an individual level, but there should also be corporate and ecclesial dimensions to this. As Sobrino writes in words very applicable to the Rwandan context, if the church not only forgives, but allows itself to be forgiven by those whom it has offended, then it will be able to acknowledge itself as it is, not only in its chaste dimension, but in its sinful dimension as well. Finally, the shattered heart is a reminder that sin is forgiven but not erased, reinforcing the importance of memory, especially seeking a full and truthful memory of the sinful past. Third, Pope Francis emphasizes how a praxis of mercy calls the church to go out into the streets to meet the wounded flesh of Christ. To quote his pithy comments on Pentecost 2013, we cannot become starched Christians, those overeducated Christians who speak of theological matters as they calmly sip their tea. These are dangerous words at a university. No, we must become courageous Christians and go in search of the people who are the very flesh of Christ. Or as the Pope writes in his pastoral letter, Evangelii Gaudium, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out in the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security. For Sobrino, the agent of mercy, like the merciful Father in Luke, takes the initiative to restore human dignity rather than waiting in stern judgment. Likewise, the agent of mercy often has a deep sense of being a forgiven sinner herself. Gratitude overflows in love and mercy toward the other, empowering the person to forgive. In Sobrino's phrasing, the forgiven person becomes a forgiving one. Finally, Pope Francis argues that mercy imbues justice with forgiveness, helping to break the cycle of retribution. To be sure, reckoning with injustice is a necessary first step. Without justice, mercy can become impunity, a risk that is not just theoretical in contexts like Rwanda. But especially in situations of mass injustice, strict justice is simply not possible, and excluding mercy and forgiveness can only further a cycle of retributive vengeance. Echoing John Paul II's words after the 2001 World Trade Center attacks, Francis argues that there is no justice without forgiveness, and the capacity for forgiveness underlies all plans for a more just and supportive future society. A lack of forgiveness and a return to the law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, could lead to an endless escalation of conflicts. In summary, forgiveness imbues justice with God's merciful love, opening the possibility for a new relationship. Let us turn now then to concrete examples of ambassadors of reconciliation looking to embody this praxis of mercy in post-genocide Rwanda. I will begin with the Merciful Samaritan Association, a Catholic prison ministry in Rwanda. Like Luke's narrative of the Good Samaritan, the roots of Anne-Marie Mukankuranga's Merciful Samaritan ministry emerged out of a violent near-death experience. In 1985, nearly a decade before the genocide, a group of local Hutu radicals targeted Anne-Marie and her husband, Emmanuel Mungangendo, both Tutsi. Their house outside Butare was ransacked and both were seriously wounded. Anne-Marie saw this experience as giving her both the courage and vulnerability that underlay her later ministries. In her words, I wasn't afraid after this. I am in the world as someone who can die tomorrow and go to heaven tomorrow. Because I have suffered, I can help others. Even as she endured what she described to me as the unimaginable period of the 1994 genocide, Anne-Marie felt God calling her to be a vessel of forgiveness and conversion. Two messages kept coming to her in prayer. One, God has no frontiers and is open to everyone. And two, God will judge Christians based on whether they have forgiven and loved others. As Rwanda's jails filled with accused genocidaires in the months after the genocide, Anne-Marie discerned that God was calling her to the prisons. Her relatives questioned her sanity in attempting to reconcile with the very people who had been trying to kill her months before. Prison officials initially scoffed at her boldness. For their part, many accused genocidaires saw her as a spy working on behalf of the RPF government. Even her husband had to pray for 3 days before he could accept his wife's invitation to join her in this ministry. Not unlike the biblical Good Samaritan, Anne-Marie was living and ministering in the volatile border region between hostile communities. Despite these conflicting cross pressures, Anne-Marie's work began bearing fruit. Prisoners gradually opened up about their crimes and showed signs of interior conversion. The initial skepticism of prison officials softened, and some even joined her ministries. Bishops and priests responded to Anne-Marie's call to bring the church to prison, holding prison masses as early as October 1994, in which both perpetrators and victims were encouraged to share their stories. The Merciful Samaritans began expanding their ministries to aid families of both perpetrators and survivors, especially widows and orphans. In 1998, Pope John Paul II granted the Vatican seal of approval. For Anne-Marie, the Merciful Samaritan ministry reflected God's grace and her Christian conviction that with God's help, good will win over evil, end quote. In her words, God help me escape my bitterness and my desire for revenge. This enables me to forgive them. Forgiveness has no grudge, and God's love has no boundaries. As ambassadors of reconciliation, what do the Good Samaritans teach us about a praxis of mercy in Rwanda? First, Anne-Marie embodies Pope Francis's call to take the church into the streets and to go to the wounded flesh of Christ. In this sense, the Merciful Samaritans do not wait for the marginalized to come to church. They rather bring the church to the legions of prisoners, widows, and orphans that populate post-genocide Rwanda. Second, Anne-Marie reflects a vision of the ambassador of reconciliation as a fearless, wounded healer, echoing Pope Francis's call for the church to be a field hospital after battle. Her own past suffering gives her empathy for victims. It has also given her a fundamental trust in God that enables her to courageously encounter the inevitable skepticism, adversity, and piecemeal nature of post-genocide reconciliation in Rwanda. Third, the Merciful Samaritans demonstrate the centrality of forgiveness in the process of reconciliation, shaped by Anne-Marie's sense that God's love has no boundaries. Critically, though, forgiveness is viewed as a divine gift rather than a political obligation, and it is a gift that is received over time. Gacaca and Kirisitu, or Christian Gacaca, the second ministry I'll look at today, was conceptualized in the late 1990s prior to the launching of Rwanda's national Gacaca program. The key instigator was a garrulous, charismatic priest named Father Obald Rwirangonwa, described to me by many as, quote, the most famous Catholic priest in Rwanda. Father Obald is known locally as both a minister of reconciliation and a charismatic healer. Like Anne-Marie Mukankuraga, his own commitment to reconciliation grew out of personal experience with ethnic discrimination and violence. His father was killed in 1963 during the Gikongoro violence against Tutsi. Obald himself was forced to flee to Burundi in 1973 after Hutu seminarians drove him and other Tutsi seminarians out of the local Catholic minor seminary. After spending years in exile, Obald returned to Rwanda in the 1980s. He was again chased out of his local parish in 1994, taking refuge with the local bishop. After the genocide, he left Rwanda for 6 months to discern if and how he should continue his priestly ministry. During this time, he went on pilgrimage to Lourdes in France. During prayer, he sensed God telling him, "Obald, accept your cross." In his words, after crying for many nights, he decided to return to Rwanda in 1995 to help heal his own wounds and the wounds of his community. He found particular inspiration in Paul's exhortation in Romans 12 to not be conquered by evil, but overcome evil with good. Over the next 5 years, Father Obald helped implement Gacaca and Kirisitu within Mushaka Parish in the Diocese of Shangugu in southwestern Rwanda. Significantly, Obald's discernment did not happen in a vacuum, nor was the ultimate outcome simply imposed on the laity by clerical fiat. Rather, lay leaders of each of Mushaka Parish's 250 living ecclesial-based communities for those of you who know, very similar to the base community movement in Latin America. These leaders gathered to discuss the appropriate pastoral response to the looming reintegration of hundreds of released prisoners. They reached three major conclusions. First, perpetrators of genocide had committed the gravest of sins, and this required a public process of repentance and reconciliation within the local church. Second, the parish would establish a formal method to enable perpetrators and victims to express remorse or forgiveness. Third, both victims and perpetrators would be enrolled in a long-term catechetical teaching and learning program facilitated by a small group of local mediators. Gacaca and Quirecito typically lasted for 6 months, and during this time, genocide perpetrators were asked to abstain from the sacraments. Weekly catechetical sessions examined the connections between human rights, sacramental practice, and the work of the Holy Spirit. Perpetrators were encouraged to share the full truth concerning their actions during the genocide and to seek forgiveness from victims. Gacaca and Quirecito culminated with sacramental rites. Both perpetrators and victims received the sacrament of reconciliation on the same day. Then, at a subsequent Sunday Mass, each perpetrator knelt in front of a representative of the victim's family, who in turn placed a hand on the perpetrator's shoulder. Echoing ancient church penitential traditions, the priest or bishop then performed a ritual rite of reincorporation, including the sprinkling of baptismal water. After Mass, the entire community shared a celebratory Ususabani feast with the perpetrator, victim, and their families, symbolizing the community's desire to once again live together in peace and harmony. Going forward, individual victims and perpetrators were asked to participate in the same workers' cooperatives and community associations, reflecting organizers' convictions that long-term reconciliation could only grow through sharing day-to-day life together. How then does Gacaca and Quirecito reflect a praxis of mercy in post-genocide Rwanda? First, there is an emphasis on the perpetrator's shattering of the heart. The admission of sin, the process of lament, the presence of shame, and the necessity of memory are all parts of this shattering. In turn, the ritual process empowers victims to bind or unbind, to use the language of the Gospel of John, to bind or unbind the remorseful perpetrator. Second, there is an emphasis on imbuing justice with mercy. Ritual and sacrament play key dimensions in this process. The process of informal excommunication, penance, and ritual reincorporation reflects an underlying dialectic between justice and mercy. Dialogue also plays a key role in this process, creating a safe space for the free speech that in turn helps facilitate social trust and counters the danger of ethnic stereotyping or scapegoating. Third, forgiveness is seen as an essential element of Christian identity. In Father Obald's words, if you don't forgive, you die spiritually. To be a Christian is to forgive, end quote. Overshadowed internationally, and this will be the third ministry, but overshadowed internationally by the Marian site of Kibeho, Ruhango is seen inside Rwanda as the most important Catholic retreat center for facilitating interpersonal reconciliation. Like the merciful Samaritans, Ruhango's reconciliation ministries grew out of the remarkable witness of committed lay Catholics. As ethnic and political tensions accelerated in Rwanda in the early 1990s, small groups of charismatic Catholic laity began meeting at Ruhango for prayer, biblical study, Eucharistic adoration, and charismatic healing services. The overarching message was simple: take the faith seriously and stay united. Remarkably, these cross-ethnic groups maintained this mission during the 1994 genocide. Hundreds of Tutsi took refuge on the grounds of Ruhango, and not a single one was lost to the Interahamwe militia. Ruhango was one of the few Catholic parishes in Rwanda that did not experience genocidal massacres during the genocide. Staffed by Palatine priests, Ruhango has become one of Rwanda's most popular pilgrimage sites for prayer, Eucharistic adoration, and healing. Far from offering spiritual escapism from a broken community, which is often the academic accusation against charismatics, Ruhango has become one of Rwanda's preeminent places for walking the long road of reconciliation. On Thursday nights, upwards of 700 participants come for sessions on reconciliation, facilitated by several dozen spiritual directors and over 100 trained counselors. Ruhango encourages participants to confront their own woundedness, embracing spiritual practices that allow participants to unload their burdens to Jesus, seen as the mediator of mercy. These include physical gestures such as writing their feelings on a piece of paper and dropping them in a basket, sacramental rituals such as confessing to a priest, and communal experiences such as retreats that focus on inner healing and spiritual freedom. Most of all, Ruhango is designed as a place of encounter and conversation where victims and perpetrators alike can gather, pray, and share their stories and testimonies. For Father Jean-Baptiste Mvukiyehi, a recent pastoral coordinator of Ruhango's Reconciliation Ministries, who's also, I should add, some of you may know him, he spent quite a bit of time in the Boston area. Ruhango creates space in which both sides can, quote, overcome hatred and walk together again, working like leaven in society and showing others that people have the freedom to allow God to heal their hearts. Ruhango reminds us that the healing mercy of God is often seen as the only possible way to salve the seemingly insurmountable wounds of genocide. In the words of one Ruhango participant reflecting on the forgiveness clause of the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us," she added, "I can now say the Our Father in its entirety. I praise God for all the great things he has done for me, because what man can't do, Jesus can," end quote. Existing outside Gacaca trials or even the local parish, Ruhango also strives to create a climate in which participants can speak openly, freely, and truthfully. In the words of one Rwandan priest, Ruhango is one of the only places of genuine reconciliation in Rwanda because people can receive true healing there and they can speak freely. Ruhango then too reflects what I have termed a praxis of mercy. When you enter Ruhango, you encounter a huge image of Jesus as Yesu Nyumpue, or the mediator of divine mercy. This reflects the Palatine charism, including their deep devotion to the Sacred Heart and divine mercy, embodying Pope Francis's conviction that the face of God is mercy. In turn, there is strong emphasis on confronting one's own woundedness, shattering one's heart by unloading burdens of pain, suffering, and resentment in the context of prayer, adoration, spiritual direction, and conversation. Finally, the freedom of forgiveness is evident, what Sobrino terms the forgiven person becoming a forgiving one. To quote one participant in Ruhango's ministries, "When I was in Bujumbura, Burundi, I started praying, and I heard about the Yesu Nyumpue home in Ruhango. I went there, and as a result, I truly realized the extent of my psychological wounds, and I was healed of them. Jesus truly had mercy on me. After I was healed, I was able to forgive all of those that I believed responsible for my misery." Let me pause here. I'm going to talk about politics again, so I need some water. All right. The Merciful Samaritans, Gacaca Kirisito, and Ruhango offer tangible examples of a praxis of mercy in post-genocide Rwanda. There are many more examples within the Rwandan Christian communities, as Father Marcel and our other Banyarwandan friends in the audience today can surely attest. But the question I posed at the beginning of my lecture remains. Namely, can we move from a praxis of mercy to a politics of mercy? To echo the famous medieval scholastic Abelard, the answer is both sic et non, yes and no. Let us start with the known. Whatever his shortcomings as a Catholic apologist for Nazi Germany, that would be many. The political theologian Carl Schmitt's understanding of politics as based on the dynamic of friend and foe should not be easily dismissed. For Schmitt, politics is an existential and even violent conflict, end quote, premised on a fundamental distinction between ally and enemy. Not surprisingly for Schmitt, who was himself, at least he would call himself a devout Catholic, the gospel call to love one's enemies is only possible on an interpersonal level, not in social or political contexts that depend on the state's ensuring of security against the enemy. Even in a post-genocide Rwanda dominated by a discourse of reconciliation, the friend-foe dynamic remains central to political life. Concerns linger about remaining currents of Hutu radicalism, about state repression of the political opposition, as well as Rwanda's recent meddling in Congo on the grounds of national security. Likewise, political identity in our own American context is often framed against perceived threats to one's security, whether Muslims, immigrants, Wall Street bankers, or one's own rival political party. Fear and loathing are time-tested ways to bring people to the polls. Having said this, I do think that the Rwandan cases that we discussed today offer three takeaways that could, in my phrasing, mercify the dominant political narrative of friend and foe. First, the principle of mercy points to a universalizing of the memory of suffering. During my research in Rwanda, reconciliation was repeatedly described to me as, quote, the ability for everyone to tell their stories freely. The subtext for many of these remarks is Rwanda's general climate of political authoritarianism. When I asked one Hutu Catholic leader if the government recognized the sufferings of Hutu, especially during the 1990 to 93 Civil War or the post-1994 exile and war in Congo, his reply was short and categorical: absolutely not. To echo the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, a politics that could, quote, perceive more acutely the suffering of others, end quote, including expanding the memory of suffering to include all the victims of human rights abuses, would be a tangible example of a broadening of a politics of mercy. Related to this is the second principle of shattering the nation's heart. Often this is interpreted, the shattering of the heart is interpreted in terms of individual reconciliation, but some of the most powerful political gestures of the past century have embodied a symbolic shattering of the national heart. I think here of gestures like the West German Prime Minister Willy Brandt's collapse onto his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto Monument in 1970, which ushered in a period in West Germany of really starting to grapple with the legacy of the Holocaust in Germany. Or another more recent example, Pope John Paul II's lamenting historic Christian anti-Semitism at Jerusalem's Western Wall in 2000, the first time the Catholic Church had really formally admitted and confessed its historic anti-Semitism. Of course, such a symbolic shattering of heart should also entail broader ecclesial and national processes of lament, confession, and the seeking of restorative justice. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process, for whatever faults it had, I would argue was a prominent example of this type of national reckoning with political sin in the 1990s. Finally, even if a politics of mercy is not wholly possible at the national level in either Rwanda or the United States, I would argue that one of the church's primary political roles should be to contribute discursively and pastorally to creating a social climate of reconciliation, mercy, and forgiveness. The discursive, the rhetorical element is often there, at least in official ecclesial statements concerning war, peace, and reconciliation. It's hard to find a bishop in either country who's on the record supporting war, for instance. But where I see Rwanda's ambassadors of reconciliation offering true gifts is they're embodying a concrete Christian praxis of reconciliation in the midst and in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of deep political conflict. When one visits the Impuwe, literally, the literal translation of the Kinyarwanda term is mercy, the Impuwe ministry with disabled veterans, war veterans from both sides of Rwanda's civil war, one has seen a tangible sign of a politics of mercy, with former combatants living in peace and advocating on behalf of their shared needs as wounded vets. In Anne-Marie Mukunkuraga's own words, their lives are a testimony to reconciliation. On this note, I will close, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for such a rigorous talk. Speaking from sort of in a sense of the relationship between the past and present, how do you reconcile sort of politics of mercy, with the sort of historically grounded schisms of Rwandan Catholicism, right? I mean, so especially for example, the notion that Rwandan Catholicism was historically ethnicized. And I remember as a young boy, in the 1990s, during the genocide, from my vantage point in Southern Africa, for example, looking at images, for example, of Tutsis being massacred in Catholic churches, right? Those images.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my lecture, probably for reasons of time, I picked up in the 1950s, but you're right to note that in the period going back to the origins of colonialism in 1900, Catholic missionaries were centrally involved, not only just with the colonial state, but also in the formation, particularly the hardening of ethnic identity. And so Catholic leaders like Leon Klass were central in the formation of this kind of rhetoric, and often beyond rhetoric, even to discriminatory policies in terms of admission to schools, promotion into leadership. This is really a central problem for church and state, and I think made groupings that were there in the pre-colonial period into much, much more stratified and politically salient categories. So I mean, one step, and I think this is a broader challenge for the Catholic Church, although the current Pope is moving the right way, but is just to confess that, to confess that complicity, to confess the institutional church's own sins. And that's where I think Sobrino is quite helpful, to remember that in the words of Lumen Gentium, I mean, the word is, the church is holy, but always in need of purification, and, the statement from Vatican II. But often I think, both historically, even someone like Peredin just wants to move on, or even current leaders, people just want to move forward, and they don't want to grapple actually with the past and even to confess that. So and I'm sure you know this and others from Rwanda, but, in 1997, the Protestant Council in Rwanda issues a very moving and formal statement of confession over their own church's complicity, which was real too. But the Catholic Church has never brought itself to do that. And even, even at the level of the Vatican, there's still this sense that it was individual sinners, individual priests. In some cases, it's even worse that churches in Europe have harbored former genocidaires, including priests and nuns. So, and so again, I think some of these ministries are wonderful grassroots, but in terms of the broader institution, and even the church's, you might say, political credibility, I think depends on a confessional stance. And there may be a little signs of that, but I haven't seen as much as I would like. So, yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. So, yes?
Was there or is there currently any resistance to trying to create this culture of mercy?
Well, I mean, I think there's just always tension, right? In any context, mercy is always better in theory. Or if you're receiving it, right? A joke as a professor. My students always want mercy in early May. Just please, Dr. Carney. But my point is that's not mercy. That's just impunity. So you still have to be evaluated. And so I think the tension is, I would say, in Rwandan culture, there's actually much more openness. Partly because I think in traditional culture there's a much deeper communal sense, a much deeper sense that if I'm broken for my brother and sister, that affects me. I think our own context, it's almost more dangerous because we can hide it. If you commit a crime, we put you off in prison. We have mercy on you by giving you a life sentence rather than killing you. And not actually grappling with the brokenness in our own communities. So I think in American culture, we're very individualistic and we have a strong sense of justice as being punishment. So I think in some ways Rwanda is ahead of us in that regard. But again, there's always tension. And I think that what helped me in reading the Pope's writings before this talk is that, and I think Francis is sometimes misread, is that he's very clear that you have to go into the sin, and describe the sin. It's not just about, whatever, dude, I'm sorry you did that, because that's not good. And there are societies like in Sierra Leone or in other places in Africa and elsewhere that tried that. El Salvador would be another example, and they just did an amnesty, and then it didn't work. You have no accountability. So I think mercy has. I think that's where the shattering of the heart's really important, and the sense of really grappling with the sin and naming that, as opposed to just everything's okay. But again, that act of forgiveness and moving forward is central, and I think it's always going to be a dynamic. So, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Myself.
Oh, Father, it's nice to meet you finally. Yeah.
From Rwanda. So I'm glad finally put the name on the face.
Yes, right.
I have quite a few questions actually. Probably I will ask first two, and leave the others if there's some time that I can ask.
Yeah, please. Yes. Yeah.
The first question has to do with the dynamic tension between memory and moving beyond memory.
Mm.
In Rwanda, definitely there is a desire to always remember this month, next month, up to August. But there is also a tension of going beyond, and the country is actually
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Rwanda now, if the dead were to come back, they would be confused in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Come to Rwanda. So a lot has changed. But how do you actually keep this tension together? Remembering and going beyond the memory. And what do you choose to remember and what don't you remember? I hope I'm making myself clear. So the tension between keeping the memory and actually going beyond the memory.
Mm-hmm.
That's my first question. And again, linked to this, the second question has to do with what should we remember in Rwanda? The evil committed, the lives of the victims, the dignity of the human person, the moments of reconciliation, or is the question in what we remember or how we remember it?
Mm.
Those are my first two questions, which I have been grappling with, to be honest. And there's no way we can speak of mercy, and I was glad you brought out the issue of memory, without really dealing with the question of memory in Rwanda.
Mm-hmm.
And given the fact that, yes, my parents and many people died, and we do have really time to remember them, but there are also many people who are forgotten.
Mm.
Those who died, let's say, call it collateral damage. Those who died in Congo.
Mm.
So what memory do we keep in Rwanda?
I can see why you're grappling with these questions because they're not easy. Your first question reminds me of a book by Miroslav Volf called The End of Memory. And Volf, of course, down the road from here working at Yale, but writing in the context of the Balkans. And the idea of the kind of prison of memory and the constant sort of ethnicized memories in the context in Croatia and elsewhere, and how history and memory themselves are all part of the political conflict, and there's no reconciliation of the history, you know, and so everyone retells the same stories against the former enemy, and that just furthers that. So I think you're right to name that memory is necessary, but it's not always healing, and sometimes it can just further isolation, ostracization, even in our own country. I mean, the way we remember the 1950s and 1960s. I remember an African-American friend of mine, when I was studying at Duke, said, it's like all these white Christians, they're going on about the 50s. Like they were lynching my people then. But so the community you're in often shapes the memory you have, and what you. So, I mean, I think you're right, and I didn't get to that. I mean, one of the real successes, as you noted in Rwanda today, in questions of development and the cutting of corruption, in some ways, in a healthy way, kind of future-oriented. We're not going to be imprisoned by the past. We're going to move forward. I guess my concern, and maybe you hinted at that with the broadening of memory, is that. These, as Faulkner said, the past's not dead, it's not even past, and these things have a way of lurking, and it seems like we've moved on, it seems like things are fine, but if certain memories aren't discussed, if Marie Beatrice Umutesi in her book on surviving the slaughter, if she's not allowed to speak, if others aren't allowed to actually be, as you say, their stories aren't allowed to be told, I think there's still limits, and I think that can sometimes further the sense that there is this politicization of memory. But I guess I tend to think, and even in the German case, that these things take time, and that there are certain things you can remember 5 years after an event, 20 years, 40 years. There are certain ways you remember. And sometimes, I remember multiple people I interviewed in Rwanda saying, a generation has to pass, and then the next generation could handle this, in a new way, with a new lens. So I think sometimes allowing the time for healing is there. So I would say, but I guess I would just go back to the idea of broadening the memory, and then, maybe in some ways as you noted, I mean, there's a lot of national memory. I think that serves a purpose, but what I was struck by in some of the work here was just the need sometimes to remember, as you say, with your family or locally or with your neighbors, what happened in this particular community. And often I think those kinds of memories are both more grounded and maybe a little bit less politicized because it's right in the context. So, But yeah, I think the way you framed it in terms of a kind of balance is probably good, because not to have amnesia, but also not to be imprisoned, and to recognize that reconciliation is also about creating a new identity going forward. That's not just like the past identities that we're dividing. So, and we can talk about the rest after. So I look forward to that. So, yes.
Thanks for joining, Steve, here again. I've been with like a lot of Armenian ethnicity to it, which also has like similar history, bad things to it. And I understand the stuff of like forgiveness and mercy and stuff, but how, in all these other cases, there's a clear, well, not too clear, but there's at least some acknowledgement of a path that could be taken. How would you approach a subject where one side is able to say that nothing very bad did happen, that possible disappointing, like faith and mercy or forgiveness? It apparently just never happened.
Right. You mean particularly with Turkey and the denial of the Armenian genocide? Yeah, I think that Turkey, even with the 100th anniversary, the refusal to acknowledge this, the continued, I think almost makes the political dimension impossible. I mean, I think this could perhaps play out in terms of maybe in more kind of local context in civil society, in terms of local groups of Turks and Armenians. Obviously, the political narrative is not moved, I mean, one thing I find, and you, I'm sure, know this better than me, but what's interesting is that in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, Turkey was much more open, and even they even turned over some people, even in 1918, 1920, and then it was later that it sort of became this and so that's, I guess, going back to even this issue of memory, often our present says a lot about how we tell our history. And so then it was in later years, then it became, this Turkish nationalist paradigm that you can't admit this or talk about this, which was not necessarily the case, say, in 1919. But yeah, I think you're right to say, one thing that came out, at least in this, is that part of, again, even the prodigal son narrative, for instance, in the Christian Bible, I mean, there's a lot of reference to the forgiving father, which is very true. The father's there. The father could stay at his window all he wants. If the son doesn't have an experience of desolation, in many ways, I mean, he doesn't come home, and the father doesn't go and parachute in and pull him in, force him back home. So I think, you can't, and in the case you're mentioning, unfortunately, at least on the political side, that hasn't happened. But again, I do think that there's often a lot that's going on below that high politics level that's in terms of reconciliation, beyond. So and I think that's maybe where you might see some more signs of hope.
There are a
Yeah.
few small groups that have they have some small meetings or something to say, to educate the people about what happened. And they might get an offense for that, but at least they're doing something.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, I'd answer on a couple of them. One, I think what Father Marcel said, there's been a lot of positive development economically, especially in the capital, Kigali, but it is, I think, spreading out in some areas of the country. It's still predominantly a rural society. I think that helps, and that, I mean, I remember, poverty is a real challenge for reconciliation, and even, of course, even in the context of vengeance. And so I think that's a real advancement. I think that the RPF government and President Paul Kagame have been very good leaders in terms of limiting corruption, in terms of development, in terms of a kind of future sightedness, you might say. I will say that one of my concerns is Kagame was also a very, very successful military leader. I mean, he really led the RPF in the 90s, and I think he still sees the world in many ways through that. And military leaders in Africa typically don't go as President Museveni said in 1986 in Uganda, I came in with a gun and you'll take me out with a gun. And he's still with us 30 years later. Now, Kagame, I wish Kagame in some ways had not stead for a third term, and I think that's in process. Having said that, I know that probably a vast majority of the Rwandan people would like him to stay, and I think that's partly because he's seen as an effective leader and also a sign of stability. I do think there are concerns over of course, the melding of the party and the government, and we've seen that in South Africa as well. That hasn't necessarily played out well in recent years. I mean, when you see what's going on in Burundi, though, right now, I mean, it's much worse. So, and that's to me has also been a cautionary tale, because Burundi in some ways was more open about, particularly in the mid-2000s, about talking about ethnicity, about sharing stories. The discourse is a little more open. I think Rwanda's a little more authoritarian, particularly in terms of political discourse. But that's, partly because of leadership and political dictatorship, and that's now blown up. Now, so civil society is a lot more open, but there's also a lot of conflict. And I think now that country is probably, on what you said at the end, even closer maybe to the edge of another war. So I would say I'm guardedly hopeful, but I also think that there are some shadows, and I think it's going to take some time to see how that plays out in Rwanda, and I hope that it can move into the political system, can go beyond just Kagame and even the party toward instituting a longer term kind of institutional reform. So, yeah.
You used Sabrina a little bit.
Yeah.
You mentioned charismatic religion. What are the resources? So is Sabrina forced in theological thinking in Rwanda? Is he somebody you sort of brought in as a comparative basis?
Yeah.
Or what are the resources inside? Are there ways that charismatic religion or liberationist religion is, in theology in particular, is impacting?
Yeah, no.
Are there domestic sources that?
I mean, Father Marcel would probably be a good source for that. Maybe you can even add to what I would say, but I would mention the work of Johann Baptist Metz, the German theologian, who I think even more than, I mentioned Sabrina probably because I was interested in reading his book on mercy, and particularly how he talks about, I had not seen a liberationist vision of mercy, and even in my stereotype, I sort of thought, mercy, liberation, theology. Two great things that don't go great together, But I would say Metz, at least I know in Father Marcel's work, also in other Rwandan scholars I met, Metz seems to have some influence. I think that those scholars like Father Marcel, I'm thinking like Father Octave, Father Elisee, and others, are also doing some really creative work themselves, drawing on, I think the German experience has some echoes with the Holocaust, but I think this is a really creative period for what I would call Rwandan theology, to come out. And I don't know, Father Marcel, is there anything you would add to that question? Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably add one other scholar who has written on a reflection on the bones of Rwanda. You go to different parts of Rwanda and even churches, you find that there are scattered bones around, and they serve as a reminder of what happened in Rwanda. At least they remind us that this shouldn't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And they are buried in mass graves, sometimes open. And there is this scholar, Boubacar Diop, who has actually made a very good book on what those bones can teach one. So a reflection on the bones of Rwanda's genocide against the Tutsi. And I think that's recommendable.
Mm-hmm. And I would also recommend the work of Emmanuel Katongole at the University of Notre Dame, a Ugandan scholar, but also with Rwandan ancestry. And he's written very eloquently, I think very deeply on both the Rwandan context, but also broader questions of violence, reconciliation in the Great Lakes region. So, yes?
I'm Charlie Yonko.
Oh, nice to meet you. Yeah.
So how do you reconcile the church's role, politics of mercy, and the perpetrators, what I call the denial? Only God can judge us, only God can forgive us. You go to prison, everybody has got the rosary, so we are in the hands of God. Because you presented politics of memory to the church outside. But for the perpetrators, now hiding into
Mm.
I think one cancels another. How do you reconcile those?
So when you're, let me see if I understand correct.
The genocide perpetrators say, no justice, no, only God
Mm.
forgive us.
Mm.
They have rosary, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So now they hide into prayers and, the very same people who were killing the church, now they are only God. There is no justice, there is no reconciliation, only God is with us. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you reconcile that mentality?
Yeah. I think that one way you try to work on that is that you cannot overly separate love of God and love of neighbor. And so the vertical reconciliation has to be tightly connected with horizontal. So to say that I love God, God will forgive me when you are not reconciled with your neighbors, you haven't confessed, you haven't expressed lament, you're hiding maybe in a kind of escapist spirituality, I think is not real. And I think, so I would say the pushing toward, obviously being in prison is a part of a kind of justice. I mean, the fact that you're in prison. But in terms of, I don't know that, as you say, doesn't ensure reconciliation until there's a deeper move to actually reconcile with the neighbor that you've hurt, or the neighbor's family and the community itself. And it sounds like, as you say, that depending on how the spirituality works out, that may not be the case. So.
I just want to add to Father Marcel, there is no memory that has to be left behind. Bottom line.
No memory that's developed. And
The memorialization has to be there. So that never
Right.
again can be real.
Okay.
Because it has been again and again.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
All right. I have another question. Since this has basically also to do with theology, and I am a theology student, what to what extent one can develop a theology of the Holy Spirit in one? Given the shattered lives and shattered spirits, broken and dangerous memories, but also given the fact that we remember during the Easter season. So a theology of the resurrection. But even beyond that, the spirit we find in Ezekiel that actually went over the dry bones. And here I actually mean also living people but who are really wounded, drying themselves. Is there anything that can actually come out of that and develop a spirit, a pneumatology for one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was.
It's something I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was talking with Professor Landy about this before, and even you can see in the presentation, I mean, all of these ministries I would describe as at least partially charismatic, in terms of their spirituality, and a deep emphasis on the role of the Holy Spirit in healing, physical, spiritual healing within the community. And for me, I will say, I mean, it challenged my own, as I said earlier, kind of stereotypes that charismatic kind of Pentecostal Christianity is sort of escapist from social reality. And at least in these cases, and again, I'm an outside observer, but I think there's a melding there that I think could be quite fruitful. I think that Professor Maranko mentioned, the kind of escapism can happen, but I don't think it's inevitable. So I think what you said earlier, too, building on the bones, that the part of the theology, of the pneumatology that could grow is coming out of the actual experiences of people's ministries, and of their own lived experiences. And those can be kind of fruitful resources. Also, the importance of pilgrimage sites, in terms of, I know we've talked before about Kibeho, and I think Ruhango would be another. This is kind of a funny story, but when I went on this trip to Rwanda, my daughter at the time was 6, and she wrote a letter for me to take to Jesus. I'm going out, I like to think you find Jesus in Africa, So I get to Kibeho, which is a major Marian shrine, and I said, well, my daughter has this letter, and this sister there says, "Oh, sir, you're in the wrong place. you need to take this to Ruhongo. That's the place where Jesus, this is a shrine for Mary, so I brought my letter to, so, but I mean, that's kind of humorous, but I think there's a way where the kind of vibrancy and the dynamic kind of practices and the devotionalism that's often in this kind of post-conflict situation has a sort of, I would say, a kind of theological fruitfulness, but I would point, to scholars like you and others, that's where the creative work, will come from. And I think even to go back to Sobrino, I mean, part of what makes Sobrino great is the context he's in. I wouldn't wish that on the Salvadoran people, but that's where his reflections come from. Sobrino working in Spain would have been a very different Sobrino. So I think some of the pneumatology is probably, there's a lot, I think, going on within the churches, within the ministries, with seeing the active presence of the Holy Spirit. Now, can we draw that out theologically, more systematically, to try to describe that? Any student questions? Please, yeah.
Oscar Baingana.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, it's good. Thank you for what you have presented on that aspect of mercy. All right. So we see this happening. It is being talked about in terms of the political platform. People are on a political platform, social platform, and you come about a gacaca, the Christian gacaca. Is there, how would you apply this theology of my brother's keeper in the clergy of the church, the Roman Catholic Church in general, because this is concerning the whole church, the genocide that has taken place or what happened to Rwanda, and the clergy, in particular the clergy that was in Rwanda, the Rwandans themselves or those missionaries who were there. So the brothers keep, is there a way to think in terms of, as I see it, a church Christian for Christians? Would it be a way to think in terms of that cachacha in the sense of clergy, to cleanse themselves, to dig down and see, oh, there was a problem that was born within the clergy. Because the problem, that, as I have been experiencing all this time, we talk about them, the Christian, them, the
right,
but not bringing the finger to say, us clergy. And they had participated in it, who said those priests who are in Europe who are known having committed genocide already in one way or the other. So what will you say about this theology of brother's keeper? Should they be sort of, about the thing in terms of maybe one time or somebody else, of that gachacha, clergy gachacha?
Yes, thank you.
To come about the, I'm saying that reconciliation within. Before we talk about reconciling the Christian plate, not our small plate, our ball.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, the language you use, of course, comes from Genesis 4 and the killing of Cain and Abel, and God's response is, the blood of the soil cries out to me. Whenever I read that, I always think of the genocide, and to me, it's just the direct echo of that. But as Tom said earlier, my sort of original work on Rwanda was more historical, and I was struck in my historical work how much starts in the seminaries and among the clergy, as you said. And it's an elite problem long before it's a popular problem. And it's elites, in some ways, who train the people to think, you might say, a certain way. So I think to name that and recognize that, and even in my own historical work, even in the late 1950s, the failure of clergy, seminarians, even Episcopal leaders to actually be able to heal themselves is very, very evident, all the way from the bottom to the top of the system. I can't speak myself to today in terms of if there's more work that's going on in terms of formation of priest communities. That hasn't been a part of my own research. I do think that in terms of the diaspora communities, I think there's healing that's needed there and communication, because as you likely know, I mean, particularly in Belgium and other places, there's often very strong kind of Hutu nationalist clergy who run websites and all sorts of things. And then you have other diaspora communities. And often I think the danger in the diasporas is that, and you see this in other cases in Africa and elsewhere, is that it becomes very ideological, you know, because you're not actually rubbing shoulders with the other people, and you're only around your own. And so I think, and then so I would say that maybe in the diaspora, if there can be communication among them, and then I in terms of what's going on locally, if that's getting better, I can't speak to that, but I think you're right to name that as a major problem, because it was a clerical problem really before it was a popular problem. So.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay.